The air inside courtroom 4B was thick with tension. The heavy wooden benches were packed with journalists, military officials in crisp uniforms, and power players in expensive suits. This was no ordinary trial. At the center of it all sat Judge Raymond Calloway, his thick fingers drumming against the bench as he theatrically flipped through a case file. His expression was one of amusement, a dismissive smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. At the defense table, Darius Blackwood sat motionless, his military bearing evident in his ramrod-straight posture. His sharp, watchful eyes didn't miss a single detail. Beside him, his wife, Aliyah Blackwood, matched his composure perfectly. Her dark eyes scanned the room, analyzing every movement, every whisper, every flicker of unease. They were dressed in charcoal grey suits, the precision of their appearance mirroring the discipline ingrained in them through years of service. Judge Calloway had spent 20 years selling justice to the highest bidder, ensuring that men like billionaire arms dealer Gregory Langston never saw the inside of a prison cell. The Blackwoods, to him, were just another black couple caught in his web of corrupt deals and backroom favors. He had crushed hundreds before them. Why would this time be any different? Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, Judge Calloway drawled, his voice dripping with condescension as he dropped their case file onto the bench with a loud thump. Former military personnel, I see. It seems that some people never learn proper respect. And for authority, the insult hung in the air, but Darius didn't react. He had faced war zones, terrorists, and political coups. A corrupt judge with a god complex was not worth his energy. Aliyah's lips twitched ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible reaction that only someone trained in psychological warfare would recognize. Their attorney, Rachel Vance, started to rise in protest, but Judge Calloway silenced her with an imperious flick of his wrist. "Save your objections, counselor," he said, adjusting his reading glasses. "I am simply establishing the context of our case today." At that moment, Gregory Langston rose from his seat in the front row, smoothing out the fabric of his $5,000 suit. Everything about him exuded wealth and power. The silver hair perfectly styled, the Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He stepped onto the witness stand, flashing a well-practiced smile. The district attorney, Ethan Marston, approached, his voice warm and rehearsed. "Mr. Langston, can you please tell the court about your philanthropic work with veterans?" Langston sighed dramatically, his expression somber. "Of course," he said. "I have dedicated much of my life to supporting our troops. My company has donated millions to veterans' causes." He paused, his voice thick with feigned grief, "which makes this situation particularly disturbing." Rachel Vance frowned, her grip tightening around her pen. She had read this script before. Langston was playing the victim. D.A. Marston nodded. "Please elaborate." Langston shifted, placing a hand over his heart. "3 nights ago, after attending a charity gala, I discovered these 2 individuals." He gestured toward Darius and Aliyah, "lurking near my vehicle. When confronted, they became aggressive and stole sensitive documents from my car. I never expected such violence, such betrayal, from the very people I've tried to help." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Langston's voice trembled. At exactly the right moments, the journalists scribbled furiously, some shaking their heads in sympathy. Darius' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 nights ago, the reality had been very different. The trial had begun, and the game was in motion. But what Judge Calloway, Langston, and Marston didn't know was that they were not dealing with mere defendants. They were dealing with hunters. And today, the hunt had officially begun. 3 nights before the trial, the Blackwoods attended a charity gala hosted by none other than Gregory Langston. The event was an extravagant display of wealth, crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow, champagne flowing freely, and politicians, businessmen, and high-ranking military officials engaging in hushed conversations over expensive scotch. Darius. And Aaliyah weren't there for the luxury. They had been invited by General Matthews, their former commanding officer, who had asked them to network and support veteran causes. But instead, they stumbled upon something far more sinister. Near the bar, Langston was deep in conversation with several high-profile officials. His voice was slightly loose from too much whiskey, and he spoke a little too freely. The defense. "Contracts are just the beginning," he boasted, swirling his drink lazily. "Once we expand operations overseas, the real money starts rolling in." A military general quickly cut him off, glancing around nervously. "Not here, Greg," he whispered sharply. "Too many ears." But that moment of arrogance was all the Blackwoods needed. They were trained to recognize covert operations, backroom, deals and conversations that carried weight. As they left the gala, they noticed a young woman standing near Langston's car, tears streaming down her face as she fumbled with her phone. Aaliyah's instincts kicked in immediately. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Years of training in psychological operations made her attuned to signs of distress. Before the woman could answer, Langston appeared from the shadows. His entire charming facade vanished in an instant, replaced by barely contained rage. "Get away from my car," he snarled, already pulling out his phone. Within minutes, police arrived, too quickly for a simple trespassing call. The reality was clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a setup. Langston wasn't just protecting. Whatever was inside his car, he was making sure that anyone who got too close was taken care of. Darius knew what was happening. He had seen this exact pattern before in war zones, foreign coups, and intelligence black operations. Langston wasn't just hiding something. He was running a covert, illegal operation, and the Blackwoods had just stepped into the middle of it. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Darius's face remained neutral as Langston repeated his fabricated version of events. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. But inside he was already thinking 10 steps ahead. Aaliyah, however, couldn't help herself. As Langston painted himself as the victim, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Judge Calloway caught it, his face darkening. "Is something amusing, Mrs. Blackwood?" Aaliyah met his gaze, calm and collected. "I'm just curious, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "Why are you so nervous?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Judge Calloway stiffened, his grip tightening around his gavel. "That's enough out of you," he snapped. "One more comment like that, and you'll be held in contempt." But it was too late. Her words had already planted a seed, a subtle shift in the jury's expressions, a ripple of doubt across the room. And for the first time, Judge Calloway realized he might not be in control of this trial after all. The air inside courtroom 4B was thick with tension. Every polished wooden bench was filled to capacity. Journalists packed shoulder to shoulder, military officials seated in crisp uniforms, and an unusual number of expensive suits from the corporate world. This was not just another trial. This was a spectacle. At the defense table, Darius Blackwood sat still as a statue, his military posture flawless. Next to him, Aaliyah remained equally composed, her dark eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone trained to assess threats. Judge Raymond Calloway flipped through the case file dramatically, his lips curling into a sneer. Then he deliberately dropped the file onto his desk with a loud thump. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," he drawled, his voice laced with condescension. "Former military personnel who seemed to have forgotten their place in civilian society." He adjusted his glasses, peering down at them like an annoyed schoolmaster. "Though I suppose," he continued, mocking, "some people never learn proper respect for authority." Darius remained motionless, his face unreadable. Aaliyah, however, allowed the faintest twitch of her lips. Their defense attorney, Rachel Vance, began to rise in protest, but Judge Calloway waved her down with an impatient flick of his wrist. "Save your objections, counselor," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. I'm simply establishing the context of our case today. With a satisfied smirk, he turned toward District Attorney Ethan Marston. Let's hear from our esteemed plaintiff. Gregory Langston rose gracefully, straightening his tailored $1,000 suit. Everything about him was polished and calculated, from his perfectly coiffed silver hair to his custom Italian leather shoes. He strode to the witness stand like a man accustomed to being admired. Mr. Langston, D.A. Marston, began, "Please tell the court about your philanthropic work with veterans." Langston's practiced smile emerged. "I've dedicated much of my life to supporting our troops," he said smoothly, his voice modulated for maximum sympathy. "My company has donated millions to veteran causes." His expression shifted to one of grave disappointment, which makes this situation particularly disturbing. Rachel Vance crossed her arms, already sensing the carefully orchestrated manipulation. "Please elaborate," Marston prompted. Langston took a measured breath, allowing just the right amount of emotion to creep into his voice. "3 nights ago," he said, his voice trembling, "I discovered these 2 individuals lurking near my vehicle after a charity gala." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "When confronted, they became aggressive," he continued, "and managed to steal sensitive documents from my car." He shook his head, a look of betrayal settling on his face. "I never expected such violence and deception from the very people I've spent my life trying to help." A perfect performance. In the jury box, a few faces showed signs of concern. Langston had carefully crafted his image over decades, and his reputation still carried weight. Darius's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of his anger. He knew exactly how Langston operated. Every word, every carefully placed pause, all of it was designed to shape the narrative. But Aaliyah saw something else. Langston wasn't just playing the victim, he was nervous. He had expected this trial to be an open and shut case, expected Darius and Aaliyah to react like soldiers, not strategists. He had no idea what was coming next. Rachel Vance stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Langston's allegations are entirely unsubstantiated." Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, his mocking smirk returning. "Overruled." Rachel gritted her teeth. "Of course, the judge was bought and paid for," D.A. Marston continued, producing a stack of documents. "Your Honor, we have sworn statements from multiple witnesses who saw the defendants tampering with vehicles before the incident." Rachel Vance shot to her feet. "Objection. These so-called witnesses weren't listed in the original evidence disclosure." Judge Calloway waved his hand dismissively. "The prosecution has broad latitude," he said smoothly, "to present evidence of criminal pattern and intent." A dark smile flickered across Marston's face. Aaliyah's own smile grew just slightly. Langston, Calloway, and Marston thought they had everything under control. They had no idea how wrong they were. 3 nights earlier, the charity gala had been in full swing. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a golden glow, illuminating a sea of expensive suits and glittering gowns. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air as Montana's elite mingled effortlessly. Darius and Aaliyah had attended at the request of their former commanding officer. Their goal had been simple: networking, raising awareness for veteran support programs. But what they had overheard that night changed everything. Near the lavish bar, Gregory Langston had been holding court, surrounded by government officials and corporate executives. His glass of aged scotch sloshed slightly as he boasted to his audience. "The defense contracts," he was saying, his voice slick with arrogance, "are just the beginning. Once we expand the operation overseas—" A military general standing beside him cut him off with a sharp whisper. "Not here, Greg," he warned. "Too many years." But it was what happened next that truly set everything into motion. As Darius and Aaliyah left the gala, they noticed a young woman standing near Langston's car in the dimly lit parking garage. She was crying, her hands shaking, As she fumbled with her phone, Aaliyah's training in psychological operations immediately kicked in. Her instincts told her something was very wrong. She approached cautiously. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. The woman glanced up, startled. Before she could answer, a figure emerged from the shadows, Langston himself. The polished billionaire was gone, replaced by a man barely containing his rage. "Get away from my car," he snarled, already pulling out his phone. Within minutes, police had arrived, too quickly for a simple trespassing call. That was the moment Darius knew. Langston wasn't just powerful, he was protected. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Darius's hands curled into fists under the table as Langston spun his lies. He wasn't just covering up the truth about that night, he was burying it. Rachel Vance leaned close to the Blackwoods, whispering, "They're going to bury us too. Every piece of evidence we have will be shut down." Darius's response was barely audible. "Let them think they're winning." Aaliyah glanced at her husband, understanding the strategy instantly. Langston, Calloway, Marston, they thought they were in control. But what they didn't realize was that every move they made was already accounted for. The next morning, the courtroom was filled to capacity once again. Journalists, government officials, and high-ranking military personnel watched with keen interest. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Judge Calloway tapped his gavel impatiently, his usual sneer barely concealing the nervous energy simmering beneath the surface. He was beginning to realize the Blackwoods were not ordinary defendants. District Attorney Ethan Marston stood up confidently, his suit pristine and pressed, his demeanor smug. "Your Honor," he announced, "the prosecution would like to present new evidence." Rachel Vance immediately rose from her seat. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was not disclosed before trial. The defense was given no opportunity to review." "Overruled!" Calloway snapped, barely glancing at her. A large screen flickered to life at the front of the courtroom. Grainy security footage played, showing a shadowy figure near Langston's car. "This footage," Marston declared, "clearly shows the defendants tampering with Mr. Langston's vehicle." "The timestamp?" Rachel was already shaking her head. "Your Honor, this footage has clearly been altered," she argued, stepping forward. "The timestamps are inconsistent. The angles don't match up with the parking structure's camera emplacements. The prosecution is presenting doctored evidence." Judge Calloway banged his gavel aggressively. "Enough! The prosecution's evidence has been verified. I will not tolerate baseless accusations against this court." Darius and Aaliyah exchanged a silent glance. The judge's panic was showing. Aaliyah decided it was time to push back. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm and controlled, "if the footage is so compelling, why are you so nervous?" A beat of silence fell over the courtroom. "Judge." Calloway's jaw tightened. "Watch yourself, Mrs. Blackwood," he warned, but the damage was done. Several jurors were watching him now, noticing the beads of sweat on his forehead, the tight grip on his gavel. Rachel pressed the advantage. "Your Honor," she said, her tone sharper now, "I request the court admit our evidence regarding Mr. Langston's offshore accounts." Judge Calloway barely hesitated. "Denied." Rachel slammed a folder onto the defense table. "This court," she said coldly, "has denied every motion from the defense while admitting every single piece of fabricated evidence the prosecution presents." Calloway's face darkened. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Counselor." Aaliyah leaned back slightly, a small, knowing smile on her lips. She had spent years studying people like Calloway, like Marston, like Langston. She knew when they were desperate, and desperation led to mistakes. Behind them, a new face had quietly entered the courtroom, FBI agent Malcolm Reese. He wasn't sitting with the prosecution. He was watching the judge. The weight of the moment settled. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a trap. As the courtroom buzzed with whispers, Aaliyah shifted her gaze slightly, catching a glimpse of Agent Malcolm Reese in the back. His presence was both unexpected and strategic. She had anticipated that federal agencies might take interest in the case, but his timing was too perfect. Darius remained composed, his hands folded on the table, his posture unshaken. But internally, he was already analyzing the variables. They had forced Calloway into a corner. The courtroom proceedings continued, with Marston parading witnesses, each one carefully selected to support Langston's fabricated story. Mr. Wilson, Marston, called, summoning a security officer to the stand. The man took his oath and adjusted his uniform, his nervousness barely concealed. "Tell the court what you witnessed the night of the alleged theft," the officer swallowed. I saw the defendants near Mr. Langston's vehicle. They looked agitated." Rachel stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. That's subjective speculation, not fact." "Overruled," Calloway snapped. Rachel didn't sit down. Instead, she took a single step forward. "Mr. Wilson, can you confirm the exact time you allegedly saw my clients in the garage?" The officer hesitated. "The report says approximately 11:45 p.m., Marston interjected. Rachel smirked. "Interesting," she mused, flipping through her file. "Because according to these GPS logs from the valet system, the Blackwood's car didn't leave the gala parking lot until midnight." Marston's confidence faltered. Judge Calloway leaned forward. "Where did you obtain that information?" he demanded. Rachel lifted her chin slightly. "The same place you conveniently forgot." "To check, Your Honor, public records." The tension was electric. Agent Reese leaned back in his seat, watching. Langston's face was an unreadable mask, but his fingers drummed against the table, a silent signal of his growing frustration. Rachel wasn't finished. "Mr. Wilson," she pressed, "if the Blackwoods were still at the gala when this alleged incident occurred, how exactly were they in the garage at the same time?" The courtroom fell into silence. Wilson's eyes darted toward the prosecution's table. Marston shifted uncomfortably. Langston's grip on his pen tightened. Judge Calloway's jaw clenched. Aaliyah watched it all unfold with satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place. A carefully constructed web of lies was beginning to unravel. But this wasn't just about proving their innocence. This was the moment before the kill. Calloway, Langston, and Marston. They just didn't know it yet. The courtroom had turned into a battlefield where every glance, every hesitation, and every whispered exchange was a move in a larger game. Aaliyah could feel the pressure shifting. The air was thick with tension, the scent of desperation clinging to those who had once believed they held all the power. Judge Calloway, usually so composed, wiped a thin sheen of sweat from his forehead. His fingers drummed anxiously against the bench. Darius remained still, his military training making him unreadable. But internally, he was tracking everything, the faltering confidence, the nervous glances exchanged between Langston and Marston, and most importantly, the presence of Agent Reese in the back of the room. They were watching, but were they watching to intervene or simply observe how far this corruption would go? Langston leaned over to whisper something to Marston, his jaw tight, his frustration barely restrained. Aaliyah caught the slight flick of Langston's fingers, the kind of coded hand signal used by men who had spent years controlling others from the shadows. It was a silent order, and she knew exactly what it meant. Aaliyah's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. They were panicking. She straightened, flipping open a folder on the table, moving deliberately, making sure they saw what she was doing. The message was clear. We have more than what had already been revealed. More evidence, more truths, more weapons against their fragile empire. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, trying to reclaim authority. "That will be enough speculation, Mrs. Blackwood," he said sharply. "Unless you have hard evidence." Aaliyah leaned forward. You mean like the phone records? Calloway froze. Langston's pen slipped from his fingers. Marston sat up straighter, his shoulders locked. Rachel, catching on quickly, slid a new document across the table toward the judge. These are call logs, Your Honor. She let the words hang for a second, then continued, deliberately slow. They show multiple communications between Mr. Langston and your personal cell phone. In the days leading up to this trial, silence, a dead, suffocating silence. Calloway's fingers twitched toward his gavel, but for once he didn't slam it down. His mind was racing, calculating. Darius didn't move, but inside he knew this was the tipping point. This was the moment when men like Calloway had to make a choice. Would he double down? Would he try to push through, dismissing the evidence, relying on his old tricks to shut them down? Or had they already backed him too far into a corner? Langston's voice was dangerously calm when he spoke. This is absurd. He forced a smirk, though his eyes betrayed his unease. Call records don't prove anything. You expect the court to believe you can explain it yourself then, Rachel cut in smoothly. Under oath. Langston's smirk vanished. Calloway opened his mouth, perhaps to declare the evidence inadmissible, but before he could speak, a new voice interrupted, a voice that hadn't spoken all day. Agent Reese, from the back of the courtroom. Well, that's interesting, Reese mused, standing up, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. Because we were just about to introduce our own records. Marston's face turned ghostly pale. Calloway's grip tightened on his gavel, knuckles turning white. Langston stiffened, his breath short. They had lost control. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, watching with quiet satisfaction. The power shift was happening. They were no longer just defendants in a rigged trial. They were hunters who had lured their prey into a cage, and the cage was closing. The silence in the courtroom was thick and suffocating, the weight of impending disaster pressing down on Langston, Marston, and Judge Calloway. Agent Reese's words lingered in the air like a dagger, sharp and deadly. The calm authority in his tone sent a ripple of unease through the prosecutions. Sighed. Langston exhaled slowly, his mind spinning for a way out. His entire empire, his influence, his untouchable status, all of it was unraveling thread by thread, and then something shifted in his expression. A new strategy, a final, desperate move. Your Honor, Langston said, his voice steady, almost amused as he turned to the judge. This has gone on long enough. Calloway hesitated. His face was still pale, his fingers twitching slightly, but he recognized the cue. It was time to shut this down before it got any worse. The gavel slammed down. Enough of these distractions, Calloway declared, regaining some of his authority. This trial is about the defendant's actions, not baseless conspiracy theories. If the defense continues this line of questioning, but this time Rachel was ready. Baseless? She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the judge's facade like a blade. Your Honor, I would remind the court that obstruction of justice is a federal offense, and if you— That's enough, Counselor, Calloway snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. But the damage had been done. The jury was watching him now, studying him, the hesitation in his movements, the subtle shift in his body language, the sheen of sweat on his brow. For the first time, they weren't just looking at the defendants. They were looking at him. Langston's fingers tapped impatiently on the table, his eyes flicking toward Marston. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, Marston said, quickly stepping in. Given the clear security concerns surrounding this trial, the prosecution moves for an immediate mistrial. Rachel's jaw tightened. So that was the plan. They weren't even trying to win anymore. They were just trying to stall, to bury the case in legal technicalities, to push it far enough back into the system that someone, somewhere, could make it disappear. Aaliyah's fingers tightened around her pen. She'd seen this tactic before. Not In a courtroom, but in war zones. When cornered warlords, terrorists, and rogue intelligence officers realized they were losing, they would do anything to stall, to buy time. Because time was the only weapon they had left. Darius could see it too. Calloway's expression, Marston's forced composure, Langston's thinly veiled smirk. They were gambling, and they were gambling on the wrong people. Rachel was already mid-objection, her voice sharp, her words cutting through their attempt to control the room. But it wasn't enough, because Calloway was in survival mode. He barely even listened to her. "The prosecution's motion is granted," he said quickly, reaching for his gavel. "This court is—" And then everything changed. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A new figure entered. The entire room shifted as every head turned toward the intruder. And the moment Langston saw who it was, his smirk vanished. The color drained from Marston's face. Calloway's hand froze mid-motion, the gavel hovering in the air. Darius recognized him instantly. Colonel James Harrison, United States Army, former commander of covert military operations. A man with enough authority, clearance, and credibility to bring everything crashing down. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, two high-ranking federal officials entered the room, their presence shattering whatever plan Langston had been preparing. The colonel's voice was calm even, but his words hit like a missile strike. "This trial isn't over." Calloway's hand shook as he lowered the gavel. Rachel, Aaliyah, and Darius didn't even have to say a word, because the game had just changed, and Langston knew. Langston's jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the table as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The moment Colonel Harrison entered the courtroom, the dynamic had shifted. For the first time, Langston, Marston, and Judge Calloway were not in control. The weight of the colonel's presence was undeniable. He moved with authority, his every step deliberate, every movement a silent reminder of the power he represented. The jury leaned forward, their eyes flicking from Langston to the colonel. Even the court reporter, who had kept a neutral expression throughout the trial, was now watching intently. Judge Calloway swallowed hard. He was running out of options. This was not how the day was supposed to go. "I was informed," Calloway said, his voice struggling for control, "that this witness had been deemed inadmissible due to national security." "That is incorrect," Colonel Harrison cut him off, his tone level but unyielding. The judge flinched. The colonel took another step forward, addressing the court directly. "The information I am about to provide has already been cleared for declassification." Langston's hands curled into fists. He knew what that meant. It meant they couldn't stop him. They couldn't silence him. The colonel was about to reveal something they had worked very hard to keep buried. Darius studied Langston carefully, watching the subtle signs of panic creeping in. The billionaire's breathing was shallow, his fingers tapping erratically against the table. His lawyers were whispering furiously to one another, no doubt scrambling for a way to intervene, but there was no escape from this. Colonel Harrison adjusted his uniform, his gaze locking onto the jury. "These are the facts," he stated. Tsabar. Room fell silent, and then, he began. He spoke of covert operations, of missing military assets that had been secretly redirected into Langston's private network, of bribes, threats and illegal dealings that spanned far beyond what the prosecution had presented. And then the bombshell. "Mr. Langston's company was not only selling weapons to our enemies," the colonel said, his voice cold, "but his network was also responsible for the disappearance of several key military intelligence operatives." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Langston's own attorneys turned to him in shock. Judge Calloway's face drained of color. Rachel Vance wasted no time. "Your Honor," she said, seizing the momentum, "the defense moves to submit this testimony into the official record. Additionally, we are requesting immediate protective custody for my clients." Langston snapped, "This is a farce," he shouted, slamming his fist against the table. "None of this is true. They're making things up to—" "Sit down, Mr. Langston." Judge Calloway's voice cracked as he banged his gavel. Langston did not sit. Instead, he turned to Marston, his voice low but filled with barely contained rage. "Shut this down." The prosecutor licked his lips nervously, glancing at the colonel. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests a short recess to—" "No." Calloway cut him off. His hands were shaking. We will proceed." Langston stared at him. Calloway looked away. Because he knew this wasn't just about corruption anymore. This was about treason, and the moment that word entered the courtroom, everything changed. Darius could see it in Langston's eyes. The fear, the dawning realization that he had lost, because now the clock was ticking and he was out of time.